welcome everyone for attending today. I'm going to get into a very light subject. This is very near and dear to my heart, and it really sets the balance of what our roots are in the medicine of what we've really studied over the years. In neuroscience, it's very new, and it's really coming to fruition of what we're detecting into the ancient wisdoms that we saw before. Going to be going over a few things this afternoon, and if you guys have questions while we do this, please ask them as we go. We're going to look at the combination of neuroscience and the ancient practices, of course. And what does that mean? It means we're going to get into some of the deeper states of meditation and what they correlate to, and how to get into these states, and how to combine them with the newer techniques and technology that's out today. I'll be going over the neurophysiology of these components. What we call non-ordinary states of consciousness. Now, this term was brought to us by Stanislav Grof, and it covers a number of different areas that I'll go over. We'll be going over what it looks like in the brain and where they come from. Different tools used to assess and support and train. There's a lot out right now, and we're on the cusp of so many things to help us monitor, detect, and actually utilize in our own practices too. A majority of what I do is EEG assisted meditations, attention and state awarenesses. And these get into sensory integration and self-referential aspects that really get into peak experiences and help with day-to-day life, and actually affects everybody around you. Part of this is going to be going into tools at the end here, and what we're going to use for assessments and training and state attainments, as well as the ancient practices and how that correlates. So I thought I would throw a little bit of Alice in Wonderland here, that we're all just a little bit mad. Later in this, it talks about Alice actually looking at a flame and conceptually watching it go out in her mind. And this is not taught or touched upon very often. And within that, what this is the extinguishing of the ego. And as we get into these deeper states, we start and stop, but we start to lose ourselves. And we stop self-reflecting all the time. So over the past few years, probably in the last decade or so, we've seen such incredible advances in technology. We're able to go over these deeper states and deeper techniques, and I've had the gift of mapping some incredible brains over the past few years. Everything from really exquisitely veteran monks and enlightened awareness, people that have really brought themselves up into cognition states that very rarely are ever seen. Part of this is blending, how do we blend the East Asian medicine, with the Western mindset? It's actually been kind of difficult over the years because you have a dichotomy here. And within this, we find a very rigid state, the physicality of what they think, or what we think in our mix too, is Without the physical, we have nothing. And in the Tao, we kind of think the other way. We can only have the physical revealed through the mind. And it's an interesting concept. And bringing those two together actually elicits a bigger view of what's really happening. So our waking consciousness is just a small part. It's a mere part of what this vast landscape that is available to us. Once we start getting into deeper states, what can occur? How do we get there? What does it feel like? It's not something that we typically get into day to day. And through meditations, we're bringing that into our day-to-day practices. And the more we get into that, the less we are engaged in our strife, in our struggle throughout life. So over the past few years, we've had a number of things. We have fMRI come up, MEG scans, SPECT scans, PET scans, all these different ways of looking at the brain. Within the EEG itself, we actually get full brain maps, and that's what I specialize in, is taking a look at how the brain looks electrically and how the patterns dance and what comes up and where. So what do we want to do here? We want these experiences to expand our perspective and basically step out of our own way. This is either about fear or love, ultimately. Do we want to see more fear, feel more fear, or no more fear? Or do we want to see more love, feel more love, or no more love? So the different domains here, we're looking at a few, and I'll go through the different meditation types in a couple slides ahead. Then we have the flow states or peak experiences of being in the zone. We have psychedelic states, things like LSD and mushrooms. We have spontaneous states, which incorporate daydreaming, near-death experiences, and hypnosis. And then we have the physically induced that come along with extreme pressure, starvation, diet, breathing, things like that. So I want to go over a basic kind of brain function outline before we get deeper into the meditation states. How they're produced, why they're produced, where they're produced. So what we look at is actually these neurons flashing, millions of neurons flashing, sending out electrical code. And we're picking them up on these little electrodes and sending them through an amplifier and looking at them on a computer. And they're measured in cycles per second. And basically, the lower the number of the cycles per second, the slower things are. And the slower activity in the brain also. And we can't see individual neurons fire. We look at groupings, basically, on different parts of the head. And these are classified according to these different properties, the frequency, the amplitude, and the shape, which I'll show you how those work. The slowest brain wave is delta, and I'll go through these individually. And you can see how the longer aspect of that, how many cycles per second it's flowing. It's anything from 0.2 or 0.5 hertz all the way up to 4 hertz, and that means 4 cycles per second. Theta is the next down with 4 to 8 cycles per second, and then alpha is the next down, all the way to gamma, which reaches all the way to over 100 hertz. Now, delta is interesting. It's what we have when we're asleep. We have all these frequencies all the time. It just depends on which is dominant and which is talking to which part of the brain. And when we're looking at ourselves in our sleep cycles and things like that, a disrupted delta signature will lead to disrupted sleep. And what I found through the years is a lot of our treatments, a lot of the acupuncture treatments especially, treat delta very well. In fact, it really helps the subcortical processes kind of develop its own rhythm, its stabilizing rhythm, and it helps with that. Theta is the next one up. Theta is interesting. It's basically what we would consider a twilight state, a daydreamy state. And within that, hypnosis would fall under this or part of it. When you get to a certain level of meditation, this at the upper level, about 7.5 to 8 hertz, is definitely where they fall in their quote-unquote alpha signature. It falls into theta once they get advanced enough. Now, this is where we have learning and memory consolidation. This is where we get vivid mental imagery. This is also the frequency that we get down deep to the subconscious. This is one of those exquisite states where we can actually go down into the deep depths of our subconscious and really work out things. And it's part of the frequencies we work a lot with PTSD. So if a person is able to step down into these frequencies, they're able to release a lot of the trauma during this time. Alpha is our prime brainwave frequency. It's for meditation. It draws us back into attention. It releases us from stress. It brings us back into the now. And we suppress this quite effectively during our normal beta waking that we're in right now. And you'll find people with trauma too effectively actually suppress this too. When your eyes are closed, alpha kicks up. It usually doubles in size. When your eyes are open, the visual cortex goes on and your alpha will reduce. But with someone with trauma, when they close their eyes, alpha doesn't go on. It doesn't come up. It stays suppressed. And this is a big telltale sign that someone's under a lot of stress or trauma during that time. Beta is our day-to-day activity. It's what we're in right now. We're talking. And it's how we focus, how we generate thought, where we're at. Now, gamma is very new. So gamma hasn't been around in the literature as much until recently. Back in the day, we used to have recordings of EEG, and it used to be on paper. And they only went up to 30 cycles per second. And anything beyond that was considered either muscle tension or noise. So within that, we never got to look at gamma until recently. And some of the newer techniques that we're seeing, we're able to not only see gamma, but train gamma. And it's a very new correlation with these states that we're getting into and what we're seeing in the brainwaves of these high-level meditators. It's one of those frequencies that binds everything together. It's also the frequency of aha and eureka. Gamma is one of those interesting things that I worked with a lot of kids, and over the years you see quite a spectrum. You see the autistic spectrum, and then you see very high functioning. And within that you have the lower functioning that only have gamma every once in a while, that will blip every once in a while. And the higher function they are, the more gamma they're processed, the more spiking that happens. And then once you get into a certain level of meditation, gamma can get turned on almost all the time. and controlled. Now, there are bad things about too much gamma too, and that will lead to pathology. But we want to be able to turn it on and off. So a big thing about gamma, it's not basically propagated throughout the whole brain. It's very site-specific. And they think it's, besides being linked to spiking activity, that it really binds everything together. And it may ride on lower waves than even delta, what we call slow cortical potentials. Now, these potentials are what we call DC potentials. So the brain kind of works like a big battery underneath. And this cyclic power of positive and negative cycles goes through, and the gamma would be considered more like the surfer on the surf. And as that moves through in a very specific way, gamma fires. I wanted to touch on a big area that we'll be talking about today too. It's called the default mode network. And this is a network that comes online when we're passive, when you start daydreaming or just sitting back and kicking back. And a lot of it is very self-referential. So what that means, it can get very noisy, us talking to ourselves about ourselves. And we have this kind of voice going on in our mind all the time that's talking to us. And what are you doing? Why are you doing this? What is that going on? And it can get cluttered. It can really set us back. So one of the big aspects about getting into these altered states is it quiets down this network quite effectively. Now we're looking at a few different areas that I'll get into with a picture in a bit here. The prefrontal cortex here, the anterior cingulate cortex, more toward the front top of the head. The posterior cingulate, more like due 18-ish. And the precuneus also. So it evaluates the balance of us between external and internal cues. Planning of the future, remembering of the past. So if you're sitting there commiserating with yourself, this is a very active network. If you're sitting there, oh, I should have done this, I should have done that, guess what? Network it is. And once you learn to turn that off effectively, you don't have these thoughts that interfere all the time. I want to get into a little bit of TCM here about what points I've found and what it says in the literature that really quiets down this network too, kind of as a side note. So on due 20, found with electrical stimulation. You can put it at D20 and then about a soon apart, about a centimeter apart. You can put another needle and stim between them. Now we're doing that at about 1 hertz and typically 2 milliamps. And it's a continuous wave. And what happens when that happens, it basically quiets down the posterior cingulate system, which refers to the prefrontal cortex too, that quiets that down too, because they talk.
Drew, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Can you expand on that a little bit? Because I think a lot of people may be unfamiliar with electroacupuncture as your understanding of it. And can you speak to just, like, for instance, safety of using it in that area or any other kind of concerns?
Sure. So the question is, can I basically expand on this and explain about the electrical components and the safety therein? Electroacupuncture, we're just doing a small milliamp type of signal between an area. What we're doing is sending an electrical signal to talk basically on an electrical physiological level to the area. And it affects it very locally. And what happens is we're getting a signal across the area. And if it's a continuous wave, now there's different waves. One is more of a sine wave, one is more of a discontinuous wave, and one is a continuous wave. This produces a field effect, basically. So 1 Hertz cycle means 1 cycle per second. So over 1 second, you just have one sine wave, basically. So it's going to be on and off, on and off. And what that does is actually, it's a delta wave, right? So between 1 and 4 cycles per second, it's a delta wave. And within that, what it does is tells the system to quiet down. Now, we could set it up much higher, like at beta. And if you wanted to stimulate someone, you could do it at a much higher frequency. Not necessarily what we want to do, typically.
So, sorry, just one more on that. So to follow that thought, if somebody puts their E-stem on that point, on the patient's point, and they use a different prescription of electrocurrent, they could actually hyperstimulate the default mode network versus slow it down.
Yes, so the question is, if you use a different frequency on these points, let's say do 20, do 19, or do 20 to do 18, you could actually affect the system. You could ramp it up or decrease it. So I've seen higher frequencies, 15 to 18 hertz, will definitely ramp that up. The lower frequencies will bring it down. I haven't done any testing in theta or alpha specifically.
An online question was, do you needle towards or against the DO channel?
The question is, do I needle toward or against the DO channel? Typically, I'll needle against it. So you start forward and you thread it back, and typically I'll even start at the forward Shishinko and go all the way down to do 20, and then start again at 19 and thread it down also. Question?
Milliamp. This is microamp, you said?
No, this is milliamp.
It is milliamp.
Yeah.
I'm used to the symbol of the U.
Yeah, that's micro.
That's micro.
Yes.
Okay, this is milliamp.
Yeah.
Quick question. Before you start to doing this, do you have a baseline of the patient? What is the wavelength that they have? Can we like make a measurement for baseline? What is the patient start with?
So you're asking if we have a pre-line measure of this. I do, because I take full brain maps. And I look at the default mode network and how that works. But typically, if you have someone that just ruminates all the time, just doesn't shut up, their voice is just going on all the time. This is one of those points. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, you can be quiet for a little bit. Go ahead.
One more question. Do you have to use an E-stem? Can you manually stimulate it all?
The question is, do you have to use the E-stem or can you manually stimulate? Absolutely, you can manually stimulate to get this. But for 20 minutes? Wow. That would create quite the endurance. Yeah, I wouldn't. And you're going against some very sensitive areas in the skin here too. It numbs after a while, but that's a long time. Okay, any other questions? All right. And guess what other 3 big points affect the default mode network? LI4, stomach 36, and liver 3. Now, here, there's a point to LI4, and it's actually pretty cool, and I've seen this happen quite a few times. The stronger, your patient may not like this, but the stronger the stimulation of LI4, the more the deactivation of the default mode network. Plus, if you're needling LI4, you want to needle forward of it and back of it too, on each side. So that actually produces quite an effective procedure for quieting down this limbic, paralimbic neocortical network. And what we're talking about here is basically the conversation between the prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex and the communication between them. Also on this I found, and this is in the literature too, women actually, they have a better response to this than men do. And don't know why that is. Maybe their brains listen better. Men's brains can be very stubborn sometimes.
I have an online question.
Okay?
My question for all these points being needled is he needling with or against the channel or perpendicular?
With this one, and the only one I've tested on this one, you know, am I going with or against the channel or perpendicular? This is all perpendicular that I've done. I haven't done with or against the channel. Yeah.
All right.
So part of this too is really reducing the activity in the amygdala. Now, we'll get into the amygdala a little bit more later, but the amygdala is part of that reactivity network. So it's part of that thing. If we have fear, the amygdala signals our threat detection, and it tells our prefrontal cortex, hey, there's a threat. So once that has a reduced activity, everything is not a threat. And I've seen this before in both dementia and Alzheimer's. And what we see is the connectivity in the right inferior parietal lobe goes down. And this actually helps the connectivity between them. So it's not only about quieting down the networks, it's about efficiency of connection. So within the brain itself, what happens is that as the brain quiets down, it can use other areas more effectively. Things become more efficient. Basically, you can pull loads in your brain if the efficiency is very high. Question?
Bilateral or unilateral when you do it?
You can do either. Typically, I'll do like one side on one and then the other, like liver 3 on the right and LI4 on the left. But everyone does 4 gates, right? So let it happen. Go ahead.
Talking to the Alzheimer's patient, are you e-stemming those points as well, or you're just needling?
No, those are just needle. I haven't done any e-stim with Alzheimer's, but I'll get into that later. There is photobiomodulation that we'll get into also at 40 hertz at gamma frequencies that we can see that we can get in there that actually really affects Alzheimer's. Yeah. It's kind of like a laser to the brain. Yes, question?
Use MOXA at all?
I do not. It's just the lab I'm working in. Now, within that, that's a great question. Do I use MOXA at all? It's not contraindicated. And the reason why, we want to increase blood flow to the area typically, right? And most of our needling increases blood flow to different areas of the brain. So, like an EEG, we train very specific areas of the brain on the cortex, and we look at a different map than we do in Chinese medicine. Like on the right parietal here, we're looking at increasing the brain and the body connection. So you can also needle here and increase the blood flow here, or MOXA.
The reason I ask is my elderly Chinese